right. My guest for today is Dr. Nikhil Chaudhary. He is an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of Cambridge, whose work applies evolutionary theory to explain the diversity of behavior and cognition across human societies. His current focus lies in advancing the emerging field of evolutionary psychiatry. Much of his research has explored the evolution of social behavior and cooperation in humans, drawing on extensive fieldwork among the Bayaka hunter-gatherers of the northern Congo. Currently, in collaboration with a team of Royal College of Psychiatrists, he is exploring how evolutionary perspectives can deepen our understanding of the etiology of mental illness. His ongoing work investigates the prevalence of mental disorders among hunter-gatherer populations to assess whether such conditions might be diseases of modernity, arising from mismatches between contemporary lifestyles and those typical of our evolutionary past. In today's discussion, I begin with broad questions to help orient us to modern-day hunter-gatherers. How many exist today? What are important classifications? And are they representative of how humans have existed for around 95% of our species' history? We then dive into his fieldwork with the Bayaka, looking into their child-rearing practices, mobility, diet, discipline, education, competition versus cooperation, monogamy versus polygyny, culture, and their relationship to nature, among many other things. Throughout, we touch on core domains of mismatch, and some suggestions are considered throughout. We end with the traditional rapid-fire questions to gain a more personal perspective to Dr. Chaudhary. If any of these topics are of interest to you, feel free to skip around, and please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you find my work interesting or helpful. I'm wondering if we can start with a few general facts for the public. Firstly,
Sure.
perhaps, can you address the question, how many modern-day hunter-gatherer tribes exist today? And secondly, there are many classifications for modern-day hunter-gatherers, right?
Mm,
Simple versus complex, or immediate return versus delayed return, whether they are bands or tribes or chiefdoms and so forth.
mm.
I guess I wanted to know, from your perspective, what are the most important distinguishing classifications? And, could you share your thoughts on to these
Sure.
questions?
Sure. Okay, so answering your first one of how many contemporary hunter-gatherer populations are there,
Hmm.
apart from, the uncontacted tribes in, the Amazon and also the Andamanese Islands, the hunter-gatherers that people typically work with, I mean, some people would argue they're virtually none, right? Because these populations aren't, it's very rare that they're relying 100% on hunting and gathering, which would have been the
Hmm.
case for, when we're interested about our evolutionary history, we're interested in populations that were entirely reliant on hunting and gathering. So usually there's some, it may just be that there's some trade going on, right? So a lot of people would question whether there were any of the populations we're working with are true hunter gatherers or pristine hunter gatherers. There's sort of comments you sometimes hear, but we're talking about populations that um, principally rely on hunting and gathering, which may be supplemented through a number of other modes we may talk about later. And so we see them on every continent still. I couldn't give you a number, but actually, it'd probably be a lot more than people think. So, for example, I work with Central African hunter gatherers, and it's thought just the ethno linguistic group, we're looking at more than 100,000 just in that region, right? So, there are actually a lot, right? People often think, and that's just one tribe, so to speak. So people often think, these tribes are like 1,000 people, but often they're more. But then the Hadza, who are another very well studied group in Tanzania, their numbers are much lower. And I think recently it's estimated that only around 100 to 150 is still relying predominantly on hunting and gathering. But as for, yeah, I couldn't give you a good estimate of the number of tribes worldwide. And also it's a bit difficult because people would debate exactly where you draw the division between what counts as an entirely different group. So,
Right.
yes, as for classification, um, you mentioned the two principal classification schemes there, which are very related. So there's simple versus complex, and immediate return versus delayed return. And one could say almost that simple and immediate return are very much alluding to the same thing. Um, as is complex and delayed return. So immediate return hunter gatherers, what it basically means is there's no storage, right? So they, as soon as resources are produced, so once they're hunted and gathered, they're consumed very quickly after. There's not this delay between production and consumption. Whereas with delayed return hunter gatherers, storage mechanisms are present. So there is the possibility, and often it is the case, that there's a delay between production and consumption. I mean, you could call many societies, we're delayed return societies, so are farmers, but it just so happens that there are some hunter gatherers that are delayed return. And this has knock on effects. And there are many reasons why food storage is such a fundamental driver of different features of social organization. And those features often refer to things like the levels of mobility, the degree of, and the degree of hierarchy. And in that sense, simple hunter gatherers are typically talking about egalitarian social structures, so no political hierarchy, and highly mobile, and that's associated with immediate return economies. And delayed hunter gatherers, we see the emergence of leadership positions, much lower mobility levels, much larger group sizes compared to immediate return hunter gatherers.
So I definitely want to dive into that in more detail. But just before doing so, there is some debate, right, as to whether modern day hunter gatherers are representative of how humans have existed for up to 95% of the human species. Could you elaborate on your position to this debate? Or do you think it is comparable? And how would they even be different when we're looking specifically at, let's say, the immediate return hunter gatherers?
Sure. My position is that, these aren't completely isolated. The only completely isolated populations are obviously ones no one's researching. So if we restrict, given that that criticism is mainly thrown out there because it questions data from research, if we restrict my answer to those populations labeled as hunter gatherers who researchers are working with, there's always some degree of interaction beyond the group. There's it, and what comes with that is not an entire reliance on hunting and gathering. I think one threshold an anthropologist put forward a number of years ago was maybe we should classify hunter gatherers as populations where 70% of their economic system, of their calories, comes from hunting and gathering. So that's one distinction to be very aware of, right? That they're not entirely reliant on hunting and gathering, and there's more interaction with non-hunting and gathering groups. Obviously, both of those things are distinct from our evolutionary history. One of the other criticisms has been that hunter gatherers, we could see them as marginalized populations now. So since the development of agriculture and then also industrialization, these communities are marginalized and pushed into marginal habitats that aren't very productive. So we're actually seeing these populations there's a bias in how harsh the environment is that we're seeing them in compared to the past. Now, to my position on all of that is certainly the first two are valid. There is interaction, and these populations don't rely 100% on hunting and gathering. The third one, there was one analysis done which tried. It's there are a few reasons why this idea of marginal habitats doesn't really hold up. One being there's archaeological evidence that actually many of the hunter gatherers we see were in those regions before they would have been pushed out, before the so-called other populations drove them into these marginal habitats. And also an analysis of the sort of biomass and productivity of those areas didn't actually support the idea that hunter-gatherers are in very low productive, harsh environments. But even though I see some merit to the first two criticisms, I just say from an evolutionary point of view, whether we're looking at hunter gatherers or any other species, I see that I would say social structure and behavior is so dependent on the nature of resources that an organism is relying on. So, whilst these populations are reliant on some other, a predominant reliance on hunting and gathering is going to lead to a lot of shared characteristics in terms of social structure. And I think that's really the key. When we start seeing a pattern amongst hunter gatherer populations, which is present across the world, right? So, you see certain things in Asian hunter gatherers and African hunter gatherers and also South American hunter gatherers. Then we need to start saying, okay, it seems like there's something inherently tied to hunting and gathering that results in this particular behavior or this particular social structure. And we do see that for many things. And then it seems like a fair enough extrapolation to say, okay, fine, these guys aren't relying 100% on hunting and gathering, but it is the case that their predominant reliance on hunting and gathering seems to be resulting in various shared characteristics. And then we can sort of extrapolate that and say, well, it's probably the case, at least the most parsimonious explanation is that over our evolutionary history, those characteristics were likely present.
It's really interesting what you just said. It made me think about this idea that when it comes to the way that our brains process information, our left hemisphere tends to be a little more dominant or more biased when it comes to processing all sorts of inanimate objects. The
Mm.
only difference, however, is when our brain is processing food and
Right.
musical instruments. When it comes to those two,
Okay.
it tends to be a little more right hemisphere dominant. And I wonder if that somehow relates to that evolutionary history of that importance of how we organize ourselves around food. So
Right.
that's kind of interesting to note. Now, you've specifically had a fair amount of field work with modern day hunter gatherers, specifically the Bayaka in the northern Congo. Well, first of all, how did you end up working with them?
At that time, I don't think I'm a particularly adventurous person in general, insofar as many people really want to travel and see the world, and before they die, they want to visit as many countries as possible. I don't have that urge, and there's only a handful of things where I think I really want to experience or see that before I die. And one of them, once I got interested in evolution and behavior, was seeing hunter gatherer populations. So when I was doing my masters, I was meant to go and do field work with the actor actually in the Philippines. And there's a rebel group in the Philippines, and just the day before I went, there was a shooting in that area, and they decided it wasn't safe for us to go. So I did go to the Philippines, but I worked with some rice farmers there. But my master supervisor took me on for a PhD, and that was part of a large project called the Hunter Gatherer Resilience Project, and that included hunter gatherers. It was principally the Bayaka in Congo and the Agta in the Philippines, but there a couple of people working with some hunter gatherers in Thailand and also Indonesia. So for me, it was I just want to work with hunter gatherers, and I didn't mind so much which of those places I went to. And it just ended up that Congo made sense logistically. I speak French, and the translators we use speak French. So it sort of just fell into place, and I was happy with any of those four locations, really.
Mm, excellent. Thanks for sharing that. And could you give us a brief description of the Bayaka? Are they more immediate return, delayed return?
So right now, I'd say with Central African hunter-gatherers, so the Bayaka is, annoyingly, people use all these terms slightly differently. I use the term Bayaka in quite a broad sense to refer to numerous ethno-linguistic groups of Central African pygmies. And within that, the ethno-linguistic group I work with is actually called the Benjele. So they're mainly in northern Congo, and I think some people would classify some of the hunter-gatherers at the south of the Central African Republic as Benjele too. I can't quite remember, but the characteristics anyway, the characteristics of the Benjele are very much similar to the other populations that come under this umbrella of Bayaka, and in all of these cases, describing them, part of what makes them such an interesting study population is that you actually see the full spectrum of what I'd call market integration. So you see some groups which are heavily reliant on hunting and gathering, which we're interested in working with for various reasons. And then that goes all the way along to, you've got these mixtures. So you've got some groups who, you've got those mobile hunting and gathering groups. Then you've got other groups who are sedentary, living in a logging town, have access to markets and the hospital, maybe doing a bit of hunting and gathering, but there are even wage labor opportunities. Then you've got others who are also in the forest, but they have a mixed economy of hunting and gathering, but there are also local fields where there's opportunity for small scale gardening. There are various governmental and NGO programs that help them have access to do this small scale gardening. Others who might do wage labor with Bantu populations, non-hunting hunter-gatherer populations who are staying in the forest. So I guess what I'm trying to say is actually we see this full spectrum from a principal reliance on hunting and gathering all the way through to a very small reliance, or I'd say even in the village, there's still a lot of hunting and gathering going on, but there are many other opportunities: wage labor, access to markets, much more trade, and that can actually be very useful. This diversity, because we can see how the shift away from hunting and gathering and more reliance on other economic opportunities or economic practices has effects on social structure, culture, behavior. So yeah, we've got the full spectrum, but I'd say they maintain to some degree, and certainly the ones in the forest largely maintain those key characteristics of simple hunter-gatherers in terms of being highly mobile, they're moving around a lot, and lacking, being egalitarian insofar as they lack any formal political hierarchy, and dominant behavior is rejected. There's no leaders as such. So,
Did you all get the opportunity to track how much movement they actually engaged in throughout the day?
so, so to clarify, by mobility, that, well, we are interested in mobility on a day-to-day basis, but when I said simple hunter-gatherers are highly mobile, I'm actually referring to them being nomadic. So their place of residence is moving around a lot. So during the day, yes, we did some tracking of how physically active they were. Well, the kids were, and they were very physically active, unsurprisingly, far more than the recommended WHO standards. And but
So
in
did you
terms,
use like Fitbits or these sorts of modern
yeah, well, we
devices
had
to
some
measure?
actuators which I don't know. Fitbit's probably pretty good now, but at the time we were collecting this data in 2014, and there are some sort of research verified actimeters where they're not putting these sort of algorithms on already. You've got the raw data of how the actimeter is moving and the coordinates and whatnot. So yes, they're highly active. I think at certain age groups in childhood it varies, but at the peak maybe there was sort of 3 times as much moderate and vigorous physical activity per day. I can't quite remember the stats. And I think a study with the Hadza found even higher levels of physical activity, like really, really high. And in terms of mobility in the other sense, again, you get a lot of variation, but at the upper end, I'd say you probably have families who are moving their place of residence 5 to 10 times a year. I don't know. I mean, there would be some families where it might be even higher, but yeah, I'd say at the upper end in general, maybe 5 to 10 times a year.
So I'd like to just pepper in an idea here and see what your thoughts are on this. So, like you mentioned, with the Hadza, I know some of the research done there, and the estimated amount of steps that they took between the ages of 18 to 75, if we include both males and females, was about 14,500. Whereas I believe for males, it's higher than females, and then for average Westerners, it was about 4,500.
Right.
And I wonder, would you agree with the recommendation as simple as, well, if we look at the mean of those two, it ranges probably between 7 to 10,000 steps, which is
Hmm.
ultimately what we find to be quite ideal for humans overall. Um, I guess, what are your thoughts on a recommendation like that for someone who's trying to live closer to a sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but in this modern age?
And when you say the 7 to 10,000 is ideal for humans overall, what did you could you specify? What do you mean by
Yeah.
ideal?
So, as in, it reaps the most health benefits, and it seems to be the case that it plateaus
Right.
afterwards. Like, there are
I,
still benefits, but they're not as high.
hmm.
And for
Um.
most people with sedentary jobs, it's difficult to get in the amount
Yeah.
of steps
Yeah.
that someone
Sure.
would get if they lived in a forest, let's say.
Sure. Um. So of course the number of it sort of goes hand in hand, but the number of steps which if in general, I guess we need to take into account that the ideal number of steps is going to vary based on numerous lifestyle factors like diets and stuff, and that might actually be quite, the degree to which you see that plateau around 7 to 10,000 might vary quite a lot cross culturally based on, or even if you don't see it in the industrialized world, I wouldn't be surprised if um, populations living in a vastly different lifestyle, actually the optimal number of steps is different. But if we go with the 7 to 10,000 that it sounds like has been recommended for people, I'm guessing this research was done in an industrialized context,
Yeah, for
or
our weird
bringing,
society.
yeah, the, I mean, my take, I mean, if the research says that, I mean, I always think an important thing is to there can be this fetishizing of the hunter gatherer lifestyle and the idea that what we need to do is replicate it, and I think that's a dangerous way of thinking, and one should always, what I see as the value or the public health value in working with hunter gatherers is giving us clues as to where we might want to make changes or where we might be doing something that doesn't quite fit in with what we're adapted to. But to we should never make the jump of hunter gatherers are doing that. Therefore, we should or even need to do that, right? Because one, humans are so flexible and adaptable, and two, what works best is going to be context specific too. Uh, so I always see actually hunter gatherer research or seeing what hunter gatherers do is more of a guide for empirical work and what we want to be testing and seeing as optimal. So, if the empirical work says 7 to 10,000 is the best, then you go with that. Um, and so I can't remember quite what your question was, but maybe that I've sort of indirectly answered it insofar as I just always think go with what empirical work shows is the best. Never assume what hunter gatherers do is going to be the best for you. And really, I see the value as a guide for empirical work.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the flexibility of humankind. And I know that there's, of course, neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to reorganize its structures and connections. And there's also phenotypic plasticity, right, which relates to epigenetics and so forth. At what point do we start seeing, or do you classify a major mismatch between a hunter gatherer society versus what we're doing today?
Hmm. Uh, yeah, I mean, when you say at what point, what do you mean specifically? Like, when should we start classifying something as beyond our ability to produce an adaptive response?
So, in one of your papers, right, you and your research group, you mentioned that there are some core domains of mismatch that you argue to be fundamental. So, you've mentioned things like time orientation,
Hmm,
alloparenting, autonomy and learning, and the egalitarianism.
sure,
So, what led you to that conclusion? I guess that maybe that's a better way to phrase it.
sure,
And
sure.
can you talk a little bit about each one of these categories?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I'm so pedantic with it. I mean, all my research group probably thinks. I mean, they're also pedantic with it, and we all have different opinions on what mismatch actually means, and then that leads to it. Yeah, it's probably making things more complicated than they need to be some of the time. And the general principle of okay, we're living a lifestyle which is different to what we're adapted to, leading to pathology or maladaptation. If we go with
Yeah.
that. Um, well, those things I said in that chapter, the ones you just listed, I think I think to have evidence for mismatch, you sort of they're these different pieces of the jigsaw. So first, you need to see, okay, is there a difference between what hunter gatherers are doing and what we're doing in weird societies? It sounds like from what you said, your audience knows Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies.
Mm.
Firstly, is there a difference, and is it, how sort of distinct is it? Is it that the range that hunter gatherer the range of practices or lifestyle features of hunter gatherers is really not even overlapping with the range we see in weird populations? And if those ranges aren't overlapping, right, so that's a first clue of there's potentially a mismatch here. Then if there is a potential mismatch, the next two things to do are let what do we think the products of that mismatch are, and that needs to be informed by empirical work in our society, and then to really confirm that a mismatch has happened, you want to show that there's an absence of that problem in a hunter gatherer context, right? So the reason I bring that up is maybe I didn't portray it enough in that chapter, but at the start, I wanted to highlight that I was pointing out where there's conceivable mismatch because of vast distinction between practices that we see across hunter gatherers and what we see across weird societies. So there's definitely the scaffolding and potential for mismatch. And there seems to be empirical work supporting that. So to tie this in, but I think actually I wouldn't say we've got evidence of mismatch until we actually go and test whether the issue, the illness, the pathology we're talking about exists or doesn't exist in hunter gatherers. So I think I gave, you mentioned egalitarianism, right? So we've got lots of inequality in our society, whereas hunter gatherers are typically considered politically egalitarian. That's shared amongst simple hunter gatherers. Well, it's a defining feature of simple hunter gatherers, whereas hierarchy exists in all weird societies. So we've got step one, we've got the conceivable discordance. We also have the epidemiological research that shows inequality has mental health problems in weird contexts. So we've got the second step, and then to find and that's where we're at, and that's why I was putting forward that as a likely mismatch. But to really confirm that, we need to go to hunter gatherers and see, okay, is there any evidence that some forms of inequality might exist which are manifesting, or are those particular illnesses we're saying are purely a result of inequality? are they present in the hunter-gatherers? And that's what's very rarely been done. Actually, with inequality, some people have maybe made a bit of progress on that, but it's that third step to confirm mismatch. I think we can basically never do it. We can't say it about anything right now because it's really very rarely actually been tested in the hunter-gatherers, at least with regards to mental health.
Right. Well, I think part of this is, of course, there's this idea of this correspondence theory of truth, but also coherence theory of truth, right? And uh, does it actually cohere together? Does it make sense within multiple levels of analysis, even if we can't empirically support something at this point in
Sure,
time?
sure.
Um, let's talk a little bit about let's go back to the Bayaka and some of the concrete stuff that you did. I'm curious to know a little
Sorry,
more
maybe I can
about
just say, because I do feel like my last answer probably really indicate. I can be sometimes I sound really skeptical about mismatch, but I do, just to say that in the domains you said, like childcare practices and level of social support mothers get, the level of inequality, the degree of social
present
cohesion
organization.
versus social isolation. I should just say I do feel like I do feel quite comfortable, at least with regards to social support and social interaction, that there is a mismatch, right? So perhaps I was answering your question more of a philosophy of science of have we got clear evidence that we can say we have now assessed this hypothesis and got very clear support for it. And
Mm,
maybe we don't have that, but we do know that social support is basically the most consistent risk factor if we were looking across psychiatric disorders, and in many cases, uh, the largest risk factor other than family history or psychiatric history problems. So
right.
it seems that is clearly a problem, and it really isn't surprising to me given how fundamentally different we are in weird societies where social isolation is rife. People are very much living in nuclear families. Community has gone down, and you look at hunter-gatherer populations where I'd really say a hunter-gatherer camp is almost like one big house and lots of
Yeah.
families living together in one big house, and each hut is a room. So the degree of social connection is just so vastly different to
Mhm.
what has been common in our evolutionary history. I think it's
Right.
really, I can say with some confidence, that is an evolutionary mismatch. And it's not a
Mm.
surprise that it's such a big risk factor for so
Right.
many psychiatric diseases. And that is particularly true for mothers, where the level of childcare support they get or help they get in particularly in the first year is so low compared to what we see across hunter-gatherer populations.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
let's
in those
let's
cases, I'd be happy to say there is a mismatch.
okay, excellent. And I wanted to delve into both of those actually. Um,
Sure,
so since you ended with alloparenting, ultimately, I did have a lot of questions actually in regards to parenting, namely
sure.
because I'm also a relatively new father, and so I'm very curious about some of these practices. Again, not to fetishize hunter gatherers, but just to know what your experience was like. So, alloparenting is it can be beneficial for many reasons, right? It can psychologically, of my interest, right? It can prevent insecure attachment. Like if someone has bad parents, they would still have good ones to keep them from an insecure attachment. Biologically, there's exposure to greater amounts of microbiomes, bacteria. It can lead to improved immunity, increased exposure and variety of alloparents can also potentially improve social skills. I mean, there are all sorts of things. What does the alloparenting look like for Bayaka? Is there like a ratio that you all came up with in regards to, the amount of time spent with their biological parents versus alloparents?
Yeah. So if you want, we can come back to the insecure attachment point you just made, because I agree with you, but I think some people would say some would argue that it may not be the case. But
Okay.
as for what alloparenting looks like amongst the Bayaka, so alloparenting is very consistent across human societies. There's an across natural fertility populations, and by that I mean populations which don't have access to contraception or aren't frequently using contraception, but above all,
Mm.
that they haven't undergone this demographic transition where they've shifted to just having one or two babies. They're still having lots of babies, and there was one review which basically found outside of the mother, so alum mothering, in every single society, there was someone outside of the mother whose presence was having a positive impact on child survival rates. And actually,
Mm.
this often wasn't the father, but um, that I guess that sort of sets the stage of showing how fundamental this has been to human child rearing. And in hunter gatherers, I think that's really pronounced. Probably again, once you get variation in the structure of alloparenting, and in particularly if we look at, say, often actually I refer to allomothering rather than alloparenting, because from a
Okay.
mammalian perspective, actually typically, and because I'm thinking in evolutionary terms, typically it's only about 5 to 10% of species where fathers even have any involvement in raising kids. So and in hunter gatherers, the degree of paternal involvement varies a lot. But you get some hunter gatherers where grandmas are really involved and some where they're barely involved at all. So there is variation in who's providing the allo care. But I would say, in general, what we see is something like half of the care is coming from individuals other than the mother.
Mm.
And
And is this
often,
mainly in the daytime? Like, is it
yeah,
at nighttime they usually sleep with the mothers, but then in the daytime that's when they are taken care of by others, or does it also happen with night care?
I think that's a really important thing to point out. Um, it certainly happens more during the day
Hmm.
because it is common in most hunter gatherers that a baby or toddler would be sleeping in the same hut as their mum rather than someone else.
Right.
That is certainly not always the case. It
Hmm.
wouldn't be uncommon for a baby, or particularly if the mother's ill, maybe the baby will stay in a different hut, but maybe they'll just, sometimes a toddler might go and sleep in a different hut. And there are cases of adoption and fostering, and these practices can vary. Um,
Hmm.
but yes, I mean, that is an important point, that the degree, that 50% figure
Hmm.
is daytime, and we don't have data for nighttime because you can't observe them at nighttime, really. Um,
Mm.
except that at nighttime, I think one could say, well, the only care that really goes on at nighttime, typically it's mainly going to be for infants and
Hmm.
infants who want to feed. Young toddlers might want soothing too. Um, but I guess if you were to quantify the amount of care, there's probably more care given cumulatively during the day than the night. But yes,
Yeah.
we don't know. We don't know what's going on
Okay.
at night that well. I'm sure
How about?
siblings may do a lot, particularly as the child is less reliant on milk, and soothing isn't just going to be a matter of breastfeeding them. I wouldn't be surprised at all if siblings are playing a really active role during the night
Right.
when the child needs comforting, or is uncomfortable or something.
And I've heard that breastfeeding can go up to 4 years to 7 years or so. Is that also common with the Bayaka or
I
Benjele,
think
however you refer to them?
the the median for hunter gatherer population, so even within a given hunter gatherer society, you see a
Hmm.
lot of variation. So, for example, with the Bayaka, I've seen kids. Firstly, in all of these cases, aging is a limitation, right? We're relying on things like various. We've got, for example, some statistical techniques we use, but relying on things like dental development, which some people have argued might be different in these populations. So there may be errors in our aging, but putting that to one side, in the Bayaka, you would see, you know, in some cases you might have kids who are like 18 months old who are weaned, and in some cases you might have kids who are nearing 4 years old who haven't been weaned quite yet.
Mm.
But I'd say in the Bayaka, the probably the the most common age for weaning, the modal age would be somewhere between probably around 2.5, and I that
Okay.
also is probably, if you were to look at cross hunter gatherers and take the median, it would be around 2.5 years, I'd say,
Okay.
to maybe 2.8 years or something.
Mm.
As for going up to 7, maybe that's been reported in a society or a couple of societies, and I imagine it's probably like a rare case rather than the
Mm.
norm.
Right.
I'd be, I'd be, I don't imagine there's an ethno linguistic group,
Hmm.
so any particular tribe, we might say, where all the kids are being breastfed till 7. Maybe there's one or two, but I'd say that's anomalous, and 4 is
Okay.
really the upper end for a society norm.
Okay. Now, I want to switch this a little bit, the direction, somewhat connected still. I'm curious about sleep. There's some reports that say sleep has been conserved through evolution, that we still require 7 to 8 hours, and now there's some others coming out talking about how sleep is supposed to be fragmented, that we're supposed to come out in two chunks, where we sleep for a bit of time and we wake up in the middle of the night or early in the morning, wander around a little bit, and go back to sleep. What's been your observation or thoughts in relationship to that?
That sleep is, there's not this sort of break in the middle where people are, I can't speak to what's going on in the huts. I sometimes, there've been odd occasions where I've slept in a hut with like a family, like maybe if there's a bad storm and our tent's in a vulnerable position, but generally I can't speak to what goes on in huts at night. But in the camp area, this idea that it's very common that people are getting up for like a notable period in the middle of the night and then going back to
Mhm.
bed, and not just they're laying in bed, but actually I see no evidence for that, and I
Mm,
haven't
okay.
heard in a systematic sense. You always get individuals with unusual patterns, but the idea that that's normative, I
Hmm.
certainly doesn't match what I've observed, and
Hmm.
I haven't spoken to heard of that in any discussions with colleagues. Not that it's been a point of focus, but I feel it would have come up in my years of talking to people, and I've never heard of
Hmm.
that.
Okay. And how about diet? What does their diet look like?
So again, you've got the spectrum depending on how reliant on hunting and gathering they are, all the way to groups who are maybe going to the market really frequently if they're in a logging town and they've settled and have other opportunities. In terms, if we go to the groups who are more reliant on hunting and gathering and living in the
Hmm.
forest,
Hmm.
meal timing, we've got a paper actually coming out on meal timings, well, being which has just been submitted on meal timing. Um, but I'm trying to remember the results. I think typically what you see is breakfast sort of may, or what we call breakfast, eating in the morning soon after getting up, the may or may not happen depending on if there is food left over. Um,
Hmm.
and typically we do see two main meals going happening, but it's certainly not as pinned down as you or I may know that we will have lunch between 12:30 p.m. and 1 p.m. We'll start our lunch. There's
I
more
see.
flexibility there, and it's going to
Mm.
vary as well on the type of foraging they're doing and also season. So if you've got people, if one day we're going out fishing, or another day we're going out looking for yams, or another day going out hunting. All of these have different time constraints and probably different
Mhm.
optimal timings to happen, and then that's going to affect meal timing too. So I'd say there's just generally probably a lot more variation in when
Mhm.
people are eating compared
Right.
to in our society where it's much more structured. And breakfast, if I'm remembering correctly, is certainly not a given that they're going to have something to eat first thing in the
Mhm.
morning. As for the actual
Well,
systematic analysis we've done, I can't quite remember the results.
okay,
But
that's
that,
all right.
that what I'm saying is more from observations.
Mhm. And I imagine you have eaten with them. What types of foods are they consuming? Is it generally somewhat balanced? I'm guessing, of course, it depends on the season, but could you give us like an
Yeah.
example?
So traditionally, they're eating lots of different meats. Say where I work, different types of antelope is probably the most common meat they're eating, but there are a whole host of other meats they may rely on.
Hmm.
There are difficulties surrounding that based on conservation rules in different regions and different times of year. Um, um, that's a whole nother story. And the relationship with eco guards. Just plug my laptop in. So yeah, so they are. I'd say, you know, they like meat a lot. Um, So in terms of the protein, they'll often either have some meat or fish in fishing season. It's very
Hmm.
compartmentalized. In the dry season, they're fishing a lot because they when there's not so much rainfall, they can do this dam fishing. It's much easier to like make these dams, and then they use buckets to throw the water out and grab the fish. And then traditionally, a lot of the carbohydrate would come from foraging for yams. That is something that even whilst I've been working there over, my first fieldwork trip was about 2013. I feel like that's what's probably I've seen the largest decline in how often they're looking for yams, and it seems to vary quite a lot by region. But I'd say that's where often you're seeing supplementation from trade, where they might rely on manioc from trade with neighboring non hunter gatherer populations.
Hmm.
Also, in areas where there's lots of trade, what you see is this practice of if they have an animal, they will eat certain parts, like they'll keep the head, they'll keep the inside, and then they'll trade the more desirable parts because they can get more for it. And then those people they're trading with are going to eat it or often go on and sell it. So they
Hmm.
don't want the head or the inside as much.
Hmm.
Or often they might just cut it in half and they keep one half for themselves and trade the other half. So I'd say, yeah, most commonly some meat, you more often than not antelope, but there are numerous others, or some fish, manioc, or maybe some yams for carbohydrate. There are lots of different leaves they eat, but there's one cocoa they eat a lot of, and then plenty of different fruits as well.
Okay, excellent.
There's
Thank you
also
for
a
sharing all.
caterpillar season where
Hmm.
there are just caterpillars everywhere, and
Hmm.
they prepare those in different ways and eat loads and loads of those when they're available. I mean, you can just go to these caterpillar trees and they're just everywhere. You just take them,
Wow.
and so there's actually a film about a different Central African hunter gatherer group called the Aka, and the film's called Caterpillar Moon. So yeah, it's a
Hmm.
fun to watch.
I'll have to check that out. Let's move into culture a little bit. And you were already speaking a little bit about this before, so maybe we can discuss it a little more. I'd like to know a little more about the balance between competition and cooperation at both the individual and the group levels. Why is it that cooperation tends to win out?
At the group level, or well, I think with hunter gatherers, let's just say I'd say in some ways they're uh, maybe not their most cooperative, just in one particular context, but the cooperation is essential, right, for hunter gatherers. At least immediate return hunter gatherers in particular, it's just a matter of life or death. I mean, you could say that in almost all human societies, but in the most basic form, you need to share food because
Hmm.
what is so key about, as I mentioned earlier, I think you can trace so many aspects of behavior and social structure back down to the initial ingredient of what foods do they eat and how are these distributed in space. We see that in many species. We can make inferences about social organization and behavior based on how resources are distributed. And in the human case, as over our sort of evolutionary history and thinking about ancestral species too, as we got more and more reliant on the hunting and gathering, that had huge knock-on effects for many things like our intelligence, the number of babies we have, how long we live for, and that reliance on hunting and gathering. What's so key to how that affects social behavior is that it's so unpredictable. So I think it's often useful to split foods into collected foods. Those are readily available from the environment, like leaves, fruits, extracted foods, where you need to manipulate the environment in some way, like cracking
Mm.
nuts or digging for tubers, and then hunted foods, where you actually need to outsmart other prey. And amongst those three, they require arguably progressively more skill as you go along, but they're progressively more unpredictable. You know you're going to get leaves one day, but with
Mhm.
hunting, it varies across different ecologies, but it's
Mhm.
highly unpredictable. For
Mhm.
example, the Hadza, where there's some groups who apparently focus principally on big game hunting, it could be that a success rate was something like 1 in every 30 hunter days. They'd
Wow.
actually come back with something. Now, that's an extreme end, but in any hunter gatherer group, there is a lot of unpredictability in getting meat. There is, even if you're the best hunter, you are not going to get meat every
Mm.
single time you go to hunt.
Mm.
So there's this inherent interdependence that no one can survive
Mhm.
without without
Support.
having this insurance network of
Yeah.
sharing meat. And that for
Mhm.
me is really the driver, the initial
Mhm.
driver of why we're such a cooperative species. Because
Mhm.
one, we needed to share meat for survival, but it's also the perfect thing to support cooperation because without storage, meat is going to rot very
Right.
quickly. And across the animal kingdom, cooperation and altruistic behavior is often restricted to genetic relatives. And when it's not, when we see cooperation between non genetic relatives, the ideal circumstances for that are where a reciprocal relationship could involve. I help you, you help me. We might not be genetically related. And that's most likely to happen when you can provide a large benefit to someone else at a small cost to yourself. When you think about meat, and particularly if you get these large meat packages, which are very unpredictable, but they
Mm.
also rot quickly because you don't have storage mechanism.
Mm.
The few days, those few times I'm really successful, I get loads of meat, but it's going to go off and I've got more than enough to feed my family. So I'm effectively providing you this huge benefit because you weren't successful, more likely than not, because success rates are low.
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
cost to me is negligible
Mhm.
because it's going to go off anyway. And then the
Mhm.
days I'm not successful,
Mhm.
but you
Yeah.
reciprocate. So it's really the ideal scenario where there's an
Mhm.
absolute need for cooperation, but this perfect balance of providing high benefit at a low cost to
Mhm.
oneself,
Right.
and that really set the trend.
Question for you, Nikhil. Did you go on hunts with them? Was that
Mm,
an experience that you had, or?
so I they set a lot of traps as well. So they'll do
Okay.
active hunting and then also trap setting.
Okay.
So many times been with them to check the traps. The
Uh,
hunting, the actual going out hunting,
uh,
um, I haven't done much of the more terrestrial hunting just because the actual skill required to be successful and move through
mm.
the forest quietly and subtly, we would just ruin it.
You're doing
The
it right.
actually again, this is one of the sort of speaks to a real fundamental feature of how hunting and gathering shaped our evolutionary trajectory, I mentioned how this shift for collected foods are easy, whereas extracted foods are a bit more complicated, and hunting is super complicated. And if you look at the chimpanzee, for example, who relies very heavily on collected foods, they make up, more than 90% or around 90% of the diet, let's say. The
Mm.
age at which they are able to independently get their own calorie needs is very young, right? I don't know, maybe somewhere between 5 and 10. Whereas with hunter gatherers, because hunting is this, it's so skill intensive, and gathering is too. Gathering of yams is very skill intensive too. It is much later, when we look across hunter gatherer populations, if you were to average it out, you sort of
Mhm.
start meeting your consumption needs around 17 ish, and your
Mhm.
hunting ability doesn't peak. That's 17 ish after years of learning and practicing. And
Mhm.
then it might not peak till around 30, 35.
Mm. I
So,
see.
yeah, for researchers to go in and go on hunts and not ruin it by being
Okay.
loud and cumbersome, it
Right.
causes difficulty. So actually, I don't go on hunts with them. I've been out with them maybe a couple of times um, when they are using a crossbow,
Okay.
a crossbow
Yeah.
to shoot. Go out with the kids when they're looking for birds and using
Mm.
a slingshot, and also maybe been out when yeah, I'm just wary of that. There's so many issues around conservation and politics there that
Mm.
yeah, sort of it's an
So
area of topic they can be quite sensitive about talking about, and I feel like I also have to be sensitive about
be
talking
careful.
about what goes on
Yeah. Well, let
hunting
me.
and
I guess
regulations.
I'm curious about this. Coming from a psychological perspective, what was their reaction when a hunt was unsuccessful? Was it
Hmm.
similar to what you'd expect a Western reaction to be like? What were your sort of observations there?
Well, I guess it's so common for hunts to be unsuccessful that
Mm.
the reaction, it's just like disappointment. Imagine there was something you were in the habit of doing, and I
Mm.
don't know, let's say you're successful about a third of the time.
Mm.
I guess just equate it to how you'd feel in that respect. I don't know. Imagine you play squash with your mate and he's better than
Mm.
you, but you you beat him a third of the time. You're not going to be too disappointed when you lose, but if it starts happening a lot and you go a long
Mm.
time without success, you start getting frustrated. um,
Okay,
there's
but
actually
they
an
wouldn't.
interesting
Mm.
idea. It was initially applied to mammals and birds, which is that when you have a species where inherent to the foraging is lots of failure but intermittent valuable success,
Mm.
that can be very important in shaping motivational structures. I mean, as I say, the resources you rely. What is evolution primarily driving us for? We need to get food and we need to reproduce. So a lot of our psychology could be argued to be based around the foraging niche of a given species. And
Mm.
those mammalian and bird species where there is a lot of failure, the motivational system is sort of argued to be shaped to keep that motivation up, so that you keep doing an activity even though you're failing at it, which in many other
Mm.
contexts is problematic, right? If you keep failing, that you need to stop investing in it. But if your foraging niche requires you to keep trying because you'll
Right.
eventually get there, um, that is argued to have shaped motivational structures. And some people say, oh, well, given we relied on hunting and gathering, where there were a lot of failures before our success, we've sort of
Mm.
got that motivation, which might be there's some sort of twilight zone of failure to success ratio or temporal gaps between successes that that motivational system is designed to deal with, and things like gambling and certain types of odds are really hijacking that motivational system. you know
Mm.
you fail enough times but your motivation stays alive and you get just enough successes to keep going back, and it's stimulating
Mm.
your reward system in a way that really maps onto what that reward system was designed to motivate you in terms of the distribution of hits and misses.
Right, right. Yeah, this sort of idea of intermittent reinforcement or unpredictable
Yeah,
reinforcement can be
yeah, yeah.
can lead to quite addictive qualities. Okay, so you had a really funny story about I believe a hunter who arrived and whose ego was a bit inflated, and the way that he was then treated thereafter. I'm wondering if you could share that story again and maybe discuss a little bit about how that relates to the culture overall.
Yeah, I'll speak broadly to how we see that across hunter gatherers, and then, well, in that particular case, I imagine I was probably talking about, yeah, this guy. He So, as I say, they're politically egalitarian, and whilst there
Mm,
may be some recognised positions like combeti, which means elder, and it's someone often who's got some influence, but it's very much bestowed upon some of this combeti status. It's not inherited; it can go as quickly as it's given, and it just means that person's sort of respected and might help deal with outsiders, like us, like
mhm,
researchers. There are other
mhm,
recognized like healers and stuff, but generally these are politically egalitarian societies. Um, so, and there's no chief or leader in a formal sense, but then you see the outside influences of words like chef, which is a French word for boss, and that it's always interesting. You see these clues when certain words are being used in their culture, but it's a French word. You know
mhm,
it's not it's something that's sort of new to them, and
mhm,
it's because they don't have the word for it in their own language. And there was this um, there was this guy who kept coming to our camp. We were staying just like a minute's walk from the main camp, and he kept coming and being like, I'm the. He was effectively saying like, I'm the boss of this area. I'm the chief. I'm the boss. Which obviously, but he was. I found him very very intimidating. He was often drunk and he was speaking with so much conviction and quite an intimidating way. He wanted to let us know he's in charge. But the more I got to know him, the more I realized he was just like a softie, and he put on this facade, but he and I think the reason I got desensitized and the intimidation went down is I saw how other people reacted to him, which is that they would just laugh it off when he was saying these sort of things. They were just laughing at him, basically. Um, and it may be the case that in the story I was recounting, or this may have been someone else, if someone does come back with meat, and we see this in lots of hunter gatherers, there's this obligatory modesty, right? You can't we call them, they're referred to as leveling mechanisms or reverse hierarchy. The way that the egalitarianism, the lack of hierarchy and dominant behavior is maintained is that the collective keeps checks on anyone who's trying to achieve this sort of dominant position. So if you're coming
mhm.
back with a lot of meat and you're saying, oh, like, look, I'm feeding everyone, or I'm such an amazing hunter, you get, they're different ways of keeping people like that in check. So
Right.
in the Bayaka, we see something called moradzo, which is like a ritual mockery. So when the men come, when that man is around, the women might reenact, like walk around with their chest puffed out, saying, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, and they'll all start
Mm,
laughing. And it's sort of their way of saying, look, we see you walking around like a big man, but we're not taking you seriously. And also, don't keep doing that, because we might just be making fun of you now, but you're frustrating people as well.
right.
But you also see these really, it's a case of convergent cultural evolution. I don't know if your audience knows about convergent evolution, but often when you see shared traits, but it's not due to common ancestry, you can sort of start saying, oh, this solution to some adaptive problem is independently evolving in lots of places.
Mm,
And we see this convergent cultural evolution with these strange practices you see in lots of hunter gatherers, where
mm,
a hunter might come back and actually be self deprecating and say, oh, I've come back with this meat, but you should have seen how many animals were in the forest today. If anyone else went hunting, they would have got so much more meat. And it's almost the opposite of showing off, because if you do show off, people are going to put you in that in your place, either through mocking you in first instances, but maybe that could get more and more serious, and they might move away from you or ostracize you a bit. So yeah, the any displays of sort of arrogance or attempts to be dominant are very much rebutted, often by a collective.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there are lots of, I think, myths out there that are still being propagated to some extent, where they're trying to. I think in media they try and point out our history as um, more competitive rather than cooperative.
Mm,
Um, for one thing, the other thing that I was wondering is this idea of monogamy versus polygamy and the other variants.
mm.
Um, was monogamy, well, first of all, is monogamy more common in hunter-gatherer societies? And when there are cases of polygamy or, again, other types of relationships, what tends to be more frequent?
Sure. So the monogamy is, again, this is just one of those cases where we need to be careful of not generalizing too much. But I would say the most common system, the most common marital system in hunter gatherers is monogamy.
Hmm.
Often there's some degree of polygyny. So with the Bayaka, and by polygyny, that comes from the Greek polygyne, many women. So there are cases where a man might have multiple wives. With the Bayaka, let's say there's something like at any given time, 5% of men might have multiple wives. They won't be in the same household, but he might have a
Hmm.
wife in one camp and then another wife in another camp. But for the most part, they're monogamous, serially monogamous, which
Hmm.
just means, like us, they might have a long term relationship, then get divorced and have another. Now, the degree of that level of serial monogamy varies a lot. I'd say the Bayaka are actually, in my experience, very similar. Apart from those few men who have multiple wives, they're very similar to us. Like most people, if I were to average it out, maybe people have 1.5 partners, like one or two long term marriages where they have children. Um, so very similar to us, but then you get cases like the Ache, who are hunter gatherers from Paraguay, who this it was still a serial monogamy as opposed to men having lots of wives simultaneously, but the marriage stability was much lower, so there were far more far more marriages in one's life.
Hmm.
And I mean, also in South American hunter gatherers, you sort of see this interesting intermediate system. I mean, this is not normative for hunter gatherers, but it feels worth raising just because it's an interesting one of partible paternity beliefs, where even though you'd have a monogamous couple, there are socially recognized other partners. So anyone who a woman will have sex sometimes with other men once she becomes pregnant, and it's thought that any man she has sex with once she first became pregnant, once she conceived, is it has contributed biologically to that child, and that is a social, they become socially recognized secondary fathers. As soon as the baby's born, the
Hmm.
woman lists all the men she had sex with, and the midwife goes and tells them all, oh, your child has been born, and they have various responsibilities. So that's an
Hmm.
interesting case, which is almost a bit like polyandry, which means many men,
Hmm.
so a woman having multiple husbands, but still there will be a husband and secondary fathers for her kids.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the short answer to your question is I'd say monogamy is the modal system, serial monogamy, but usually, even in those societies, there may be some low polygyny rates, and those low
Hmm.
polygyny rates may be as low as zero. And I think probably the modal rate is about 10%.
Hmm.
10% of partnerships are polygynous.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I was curious about this specifically, not just to to debunk people who are always saying like, oh, we evolved not to be monogamous and so on and
Mm,
so forth. But it's also this idea of if we bring it to modern context, there was a study looking at individuals looking at social media and people looking at attractive faces, specifically
mm,
attractive female faces, right? And it was just, I believe it was just 10 pictures of attractive female faces, and males in relationships already felt less committed, and females who viewed those faces felt threatened in some way.
right.
And right. I guess I was curious if there's any link there, for example, between the amount of partners people evolve to
Mm,
have, or amount of people, attractive faces that perhaps they perceive within a tribe, versus what
mm.
we're currently being exposed to, and if that could be relevant in any way.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'd say is that the sort of human mating and marital patterns are one case where we see incredible diversity and flexibility.
Mm,
So even though in hunter gatherers, as I say, there is variation, but we might say, okay, if we had to pick one marital system, which was the norm in our evolutionary history, it would be monogamy. I think that's fair to say. Um,
mm,
some people would debate that even, but I think that's okay to say. But that is
mm,
importantly the marital system, not the mating
mm,
system. So we have very little idea of the amount of extra pair copulations that are going on, how many affairs are happening, or even sort of accepted in certain cultures. We see that affairs can, like in the case, or non-marital sex is sometimes accepted in certain contexts.
mm,
So we see a lot of flexibility, and we don't know how promiscuous, let's say, hunter gatherers were. And even
mm.
now, I mean, getting the ethics for genetic data is a bit complicated, but you can do it. But no one's done that rigorously with hunter gatherers.
Mhm.
But we certainly see as soon as agriculture emerged, and as soon as you have the best predictor of rates of polygyny, or one of them, is the inequality
Mm,
in male resource holding. You know, we see this in many species where there's any male provisioning. When you have high rates of inequality, often wealthier males or males with more access to resources might have multiple wives, and poorer males, as such, may have no wives.
mm,
So certainly, I think because and in pastoralist societies, as many people here, like the number of cattle, the amount of cattle you have is going to predict the number of wives you have. So certainly, I think,
yeah.
given the amount of within species variation we see in marital patterns, let alone mating patterns, which we don't know as much about because you have to do
Mhm.
genetics for that. Um, we can say that there's not some sort of human norm or disposition. I think it is one area where there's a lot of flexibility. And I
I
think,
see.
strangely, I often give this example to students when they're asking, oh, well, how does this all work in terms of evolution and behavior more generally? And I always give the example of, well, what happens is you've got environmental stimuli and you've got genetic predispositions where your hormones have evolved to react to those stimuli. So maybe it is the case that you can do an experiment and you put someone around lots of attractive females, that then the exposure to that stimulus then changes their testosterone levels, which we know then has an effect on their sort of relative investment in trying to get mates versus looking after their kids, and being focused on their primary partner.
Mhm,
And I certainly think that is a flexible system that exists, right? So
mhm,
testosterone is one modulator of the degree to which males invest in mating versus parenting and manage this trade off.
right.
And that will be impacted by exposure to stimuli about the availability of mating opportunities, right? So the degree to which males may, for example, be sensitive or shift towards more of a mating strategy is going to be things like, well, what are the payoffs to that? if there are lots of other people that can care for their offspring, then the opportunity cost of mating rather than parenting is lower. Or if they're highly attractive, the
Mm-hmm.
likelihood of success in mating effort is higher. If there are lots of single females, the likelihood of success is higher, so the sex ratio can have an effect. All of these things are going to determine what is the optimal strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say the difference between males and females here is one of fundamental reproductive biology, insofar as the potential number of offspring a male can produce is far higher than a female, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
particularly in
Yeah.
mammals, the reproductive rate of females is constrained. They've got this, in humans, 9-month pregnancy period, then they might
Yeah.
not be able to conceive while breastfeeding. So a
Mm-hmm.
woman can only have far fewer offspring than the number a male could potentially conceive multiple offspring a
Mm-hmm.
day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because
Mm-hmm.
of this, natural selection has shaped males to, under certain circumstances, there is the possibility of a sort of more mating focused strategy where they try and have sex with lots of women or have multiple partners, whereas the number of partners a woman has is not going to affect the number of babies she has, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the limiting resource on her reproductive output is not access to mating partners, whereas for males it is. So you're going to see different reactions when you expose males versus females to stimuli indicating there's opportunity for mating with attractive people. And in particular, because females are limited in the quantity of offspring they can have, they have to sort of follow a quality strategy, ensure as far as possible the survival and quality of those few offspring they can have. And for that, they
Mm-hmm.
want as much investment as possible. So they're going to, any threat that their partner might go off with someone else is very risky for them. It means that one of the few offspring they can have, or potentially all of the
Mm-hmm.
few offspring they can have, won't have a
Yeah.
father investing in them. So they might
Right.
find that stimulus that you refer to threatening. All of that said, I don't know how strong the replicability of many of these they vary, but some I'm quite skeptical of some of the sort of classical evolutionary psychology mating studies and
Okay.
sex studies, how much
Okay.
they replicate. But yeah,
Okay. So, for the sake of time, I want to transition us to a bit of a different topic, and it's now more so shedding a light on mental health. So, firstly, sometimes on, on news lines or headlines, you'll see that it says that hunter-gatherer societies are happier than industrialized societies. I'm wondering if you could shed some light to this, and what are some mental health conditions that don't show up that don't seem to show up, at least to our knowledge, in hunter-gatherer societies versus those that you do believe may actually be psychological illnesses in the modern day.
yeah, I have to give a probably boring answer to this, which is that we don't know, and those headlines
Okay.
should not be taken seriously. Um,
Mm,
Insofar as the amount of work that's been done looking at psychological well-being or the prevalence of mental illness in hunter gatherers is close to zero. There's like a
mm,
handful of studies and serious methodological issues. I'm not criticizing the researchers. It's better that they've done something than nothing.
yeah.
But really, to do this properly is a really long investment. And the development of appropriate methods for diagnosis is difficult. So there are a couple of studies which have used existing scales of self-rated psychological well-being. So they'll ask things like, how satisfied are you with your life? But they're often using like Likert scale type techniques, and are you very satisfied, quite satisfied? And I think most people who work with hunter gatherers know that the way even they think about quantity is quite different. I think even when we get asked to answer these Likert scale questions, it can be for lots of people. They're like, oh, I don't really know how to pick the right one, and I'm highly skeptical of how transferable they are. And as such, even though the results might indicate slightly higher levels of subjective well-being from these 2 or 3 studies, I'd say very, very provisional data. As for psychiatric disorders, in terms of quantitative studies that have been done, so I'm not talking about here, cross-cultural psychiatry where it may not prevalence rates haven't really been assessed, but in terms of quantitative sort of systematic examination, again, I'd say there's virtually nothing robust that's been done. There was a study on postnatal depression, which had a sample size of 20, so already trying to get a prevalence rate from that wouldn't make sense. They did certainly find almost half the participants went beyond the threshold of using this very famous scale, the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, went beyond this screening threshold for probable postpartum depression. But there are, again, it's not transferable. There are questions in that. It seemed like a lot of that might have been to do with anxiety about the child's safety, which makes complete sense in a population where child mortality rates are 30-40%. So I don't think one can conclude too much from that. There was another study which looked at a few different internal and externalizing problems and concluded something about a certain rate of autism in, I think it was in the Hadza, all sorts of methodological issues with that. And again, the sample size is just completely inadequate. So
Okay.
basically,
So,
we don't know. I do
okay.
think mental illness exists in hunter gatherers, right? So the
Mhm.
idea that it doesn't, I don't think it makes sense, and there are numerous reasons for that.
Mhm.
I think it's feasible. It's lower. Prevalence rates are lower.
How about this? In the Bayaka, they have their own language, right? Are
Yeah,
there words,
Benjele is one
Angela?
ethno-linguistic group, and then there are
Oh,
other
okay.
Bayaka groups who have different languages.
So, are there words that we have in English in relationship to mental health that don't exist within their language, or vice versa?
Hmm. Yeah, so this, I mean, really speaks to what I was referring to. To do this work, you really need to do it properly, and to get to get an understanding of the language. It's hard enough even when you speak the same language as someone to define emotions and to truly understand, particularly if it's an emotion or an illness someone hasn't experienced. If I were so then to go in another context where there's no like diagnostic manual or list of illnesses, it's very difficult to say, is there a word for this or isn't there? But I would say there's this idea of idioms of distress, which is that different cultures have different ways of expressing different psychological issues, and often linguistic ways. So, I mean, I'd say with the Bayaka, I often hear this thing of canicid, like thinking too much, which actually appears in numerous populations and seems, I hear that in context that makes me think it's quite a general term for psychological distress rather than something specific or something limited or narrow. There's also this term mawa they use, which I think, I'd seen someone translate it as grief, but again, I think maybe you could translate it as, again, just a sort of sense of loss, distress associated with loss. So, of course, I think probably there are different idioms and different words that refer to different emotions. I My expectation is they wouldn't have the same level of diversity of mental illness term. The DSM that you were talking about hundreds and hundreds of terms, which certainly wouldn't exist there. Um, but yeah, I know there's another population, I can't remember where it is, where they say problem with the belly when they're very sad. Um, and this there are interesting clues. Language can offer very interesting clues about what's actually going on and how things manifest in different cultures. And I think you see a lot of variation. And
Yeah. So with the Bayaka, when people think about hunter gatherer societies, they often think that they're primitive, right? That there's no sophistication to them in some way. Obviously, it's a vast generalization and probably a terrible myth to propagate. But I'm wondering, was there anything specifically that surprised you about the way they think, or their spirituality, or their relationship with nature, or could you speak to any of the stuff that I mentioned, or anything beyond?
yeah, the so surprising stuff. Yeah, numerous things. It's so I mean, talking about sophistication or this idea of primitive, I mean, it's just a matter of domains. I think inherently people will judge the sophistication of another culture based on what they're used to. Um,
Mm,
so, yeah, they don't have laptops or do, trigonometry, but then their understanding of the physical environment is just leaps and bounds compared to anything we can even imagine. They know
mm,
hundreds of plants, use them for different things, know the life cycle, know how to prepare them in different ways, know how they change in the season. They know how to navigate in a way which is just completely unbelievable to me when you're walking with them in the forest. You really are just like, how on earth do you know where we are? You might be going to a different. There's this one. We wanted to go to this area where you see crocodiles, and this guy was like, "Yeah, we can leave in the morning." And it would have been like we were going to basically go on an 11-hour walk through an environment which, for the most part, just looks to me exactly the same.
mm,
And the way they navigate is just incredible. So I would just say this: yes, they don't have sophisticated sort of electronic technology like we do, but yeah, the idea of calling them primitive just makes no sense to me. And certainly there's I guess the connotations with that word are almost slightly derogatory, and I feel
yeah.
any one of us who goes to one of those cultures would often feel embarrassed about their own incompetence, right? So it's just a
Hmm.
matter of different skills in different contexts, and actually, I
Right.
think sometimes the way our economy is, our skills are quite narrow. We lack some very basic, fundamental skills about, like I say, to do with navigation. They're
Hmm.
going to survive a lot better than us if
Mm,
it came to it, and we just had to. Um, for any one individual, if I took you or me and put us in any place on Earth, then we weren't allowed to get help from others, and we weren't allowed to go
hmm.
to the supermarket. They're far more
Hmm.
resilient and resourceful than we are.
Right.
Um, so
And do they
the
hold a special relationship with nature? Is it a part of their spirituality in some way? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would their sort of traditional religious or spiritual beliefs are intrinsically intertwined with the sacredness of the forest, and they have many
Mm,
different spirits of the forest, which manifest when you see what those spirits look like. This all sounds a bit strange, and it's hard to explain unless you're there. Um, how have the appearance of things we see in nature. So it is very sacred. There are ideas about how to treat the forest and how to not completely saturate it, and how to treat it. So yeah, nature is definitely sacred, and I guess what you see in a lot of small scale societies. So before you get large scale agriculture or really large groups, you see religions. if you were to use a very broad categorization, you could say animistic religions, and let's say rather than having moralistic gods where there's this sort of conscious individual who has interests in us and rules about how we should behave towards one another. The sacred is much more about what's proximate in nature, and many things are sacred. And there are more sort of maybe non-functional, well, seemingly non-functional ritualistic practices, which are more about not going to a particular river at a particular time of year, rather than, oh, thou shalt not commit adultery. So there's much more of the spirituality and morality, even one could say, is based around and values is based around nature and the sacredness of the environment.
Mm.
When you say things that surprised me, I think maybe above all, the one most standout thing is the competencies that and freedom that very young children and even infants are given. Um,
Mm.
it is not rare to see an infant who can't walk hold a machete. People are around and they might intervene if they need to. They surprisingly don't need to quite often. Um, and a young child, I've I've seen through. I've seen a child. I remember this child who's still breastfeeding. I think we aged him under 2, and I was really impressed with the way he was cutting some plants with a
Mm.
machete. They're handling embers to get a fire going from a very young age. The competency of 1-year-olds comparatively to our society and 2-year-olds and
Right.
3-year-olds is just, it makes you realize how little credit we give to the capacities of children
Mm.
to interact with
Mm.
their environment. Um,
And what did discipline look
Giving a
like?
child a machete or fire, but they're really like 2-year-olds will
Yeah,
touch
that's crazy.
machetes and embers all the time.
Hmm. Hmm. And what did discipline look like, by the way, when it came to somebody who did step out of bounds in some way?
Kids, are we referring to disciplining of children? When you
Actually,
say
both kids and adults. Actually, I'm kind of curious. What was
so,
conflict resolution? And yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I would say that what I saw on my most recent trip this year
Mm.
felt quite distinct to what I had seen in the past. Now, a lot of change is always going on, and I saw numerous things this year which I hadn't seen, which were very different to what I saw 10, 12 years ago.
Hmm.
And I did feel like I saw more higher prevalence of shouting, or perhaps more. I don't. Let's just say negative reactions to, say, children crying and stuff. Whereas in the past, and I've written about this, what we often see in hunter gatherers is, I guess, what we describe as sensitive caregiving, which is where sensitive caregiving sort of refers to noticing, correctly interpreting, and then responding to the needs of a child who's signaling something. Um, and I'd say in hunter gatherers, what's often reported is very child centered caregiving, where so children certainly wouldn't be scolded for crying, and actually their needs would be typically attended to. But the reason I bring that up is because you talk about disciplining. I did see more cases this time. I mean, I'd seen it before, but it was rare. I did see some cases this time of children sort of, maybe we could say, being disciplined where when they were crying. Um, if a ch- I have seen cases of children, you know, being hit. I wouldn't say it's common, but I have seen it. Um, there's certainly there's not discipline in some sense. The context of rule breaking is narrower because there's not the same level of parental sort of control over what the child should be doing at any given moment. Children are surprisingly autonomous and spend a lot of the day just going off doing stuff. Don't get me wrong, they can do stuff which annoys their parents or breaks a social norm, and they could be shouted at, or in some cases, like I say, I've seen them be hit, slightly older kids. Um, but a lot of the time, they're just going off doing their own thing. And in that sense, they're not being observed doing things that are wrong necessarily. And they're not expected to be around or whatever. They spend a lot of the day just in play groups with other kids, not really many adults around, and they're just going off doing their own thing. Um, so, yeah. And as for discipline of adults, like I say, you see in hunter gatherers these leveling mechanism where one of them, the primary reason an adult would be disciplined, let's say, is either due to any expression of self-aggrandizing, any attempts to achieve a higher dominant position,
Hmm.
or tell people what to do, or selfishness, not
Hmm.
sharing. And discipline in those cases can be mockery often, like I said, with the Morazzo, where they sort of have this ritualized mockery. But we
Hmm.
also see cases where there's sort of ostracism and or reports of ostracism. People also talk about moving with your feet in hunter gatherers, that because they're nomadic and mobile, one of the ways they deal with conflict, or if someone's behaving in a way that they don't like, is they just move, right? They just vote with their feet. They just move to another camp, and
Hmm.
there are various reasons. There's a study which implies actually, if you're breaking social norms a lot, you're not going to end up with very cooperative partners because people keep moving away from you. So
Hmm.
that's a sort of passive way of disciplining, I guess, a sort of passive ostracism. And there's
So,
certainly fights break out as well.
mm,
I see plenty
okay.
of fights.
So when people, let's say two important people, disagree with each other, is it common at all for the whole group to come together to try and resolve the conflict, or do they just group up with like elders, or and also was there a shaman?
Sure. So the quick answer to the question about shaman is, yeah, you get ngangas who are healers. They know a lot about
Mm.
using medicinal plants, and
Hmm.
they, in some cases, are thought to have more sort of supernatural abilities, like looking in, for example, some ngangas can look at fire and then answer questions you might have about, like, oh, who committed
Mm.
this crime where we don't know. And so
Oh,
I guess
interesting.
that sort of approximates a shaman in
Mm.
having some supernatural abilities. The dealing with conflict, yeah, it can vary, but yeah, I think you see a lot of community involvement in dealing with conflict. If two people are disagreeing, there's a lot of expression about it. So they have this practice called Masambo, which happens typically first thing in the morning or late at night. So it's happening when everyone's in their tent. Either they haven't got out their tent in their morning, or they've returned to their, not tents, sorry, their huts. I'm in the tent, but everyone else is in the hut, either early in the morning or late at night. And the person who's annoyed, or if they've got a grievance with someone else, they just walk around the camp shouting very expressively. Almost, there's a musical nature to it almost, because it
Mm.
can be quite repetitive, and there's something, it's very expressive, and they're just shouting out like, oh, this person, I saw they had lots of meat but they put it in their tent and didn't share it with anyone. I'm so tired of dealing with their bullshit or whatever. um, so that's sort of letting that person and also the community know that you've got a grievance, and then there are often
Mm.
these discussions that are happening next day. It's not, so it can be a matter of like, let's sit down and talk about this, but often it's happening not in that systematic way, but yes, everyone's talking and helping resolve
Yes.
it, or at least many other people beyond the two people involved in the conflict have their opinion and their say. But weirdly, it can happen with a lot of humor as well. Often there's this conflict and there might be this
Hmm.
discussion resolution, but you see, even later in the, it can feel quite dramatic, but even at later in the evening, they're just laughing about it like it was hilarious. I mean, one of my PhD students said an interesting thing of like this is almost some sort of cultural adaptation to be able to deal with these conflicts all the time. You have to have a sort of reduced sensitivity, almost immunity, and be able to find them humorous because
Mm,
otherwise the community would just disintegrate entirely.
right, right. Okay. Well, what's the biggest change in your own lifestyle that's occurred since working with them?
Hmm. What that I've taken back with me here in
Yeah.
my life here? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, I don't know if there has. I mean, I was always quite a nomadic person, but maybe that's been reinforced,
Mm,
or my comfort with it has sustained in a way that maybe it doesn't for adults around my age. In that I do it is quite common for me to stay in four different places within a week. I might be at my own place in Cambridge for a few days,
hmm
then later in the week go and stay with a friend, and then see family for one night, and then spend another night at a friend's house. So yeah, it's quite common for me to be in sleep at three or four different residences in a week, and I don't know whether to attribute that to my time there, but I guess, of course, during the fieldwork, we're not moving around at that frequency, but maybe there's just a comfort with moving around to some degree and living with different people to some degree and not having necessarily this set, prolonged home. But
hmm
I don't know. I don't know if that's sort of just my disposition more generally. I'm just trying to think if there is anything else which is very notable that I think I don't know. I don't know whether I've become a bit. I think maybe I had some risk aversion type disposition, and having lived in the forest and just sort of seen that, oh, these people are living in a very different way, and many of the things they're exposed to, like there being animals around or different parasites and pathologies, and you sort of
hmm
realize like, oh, like we're quite robust. Like I know, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of illness and death there, but the degree to which we catastrophize, like you know how I went in there really fearful of the sort of dangers I might encounter, and don't get me wrong, there
hmm
are some, but I think maybe I've just become a bit looser in recognizing that our culture in particular probably overweights risk with things we're not
Right.
familiar with. And then going to
hmm
such an unfamiliar environment and seeing people exposed to certain risks that we would weight really, really high, and seeing that, oh, well,
mm
it's usually fine, whatever.
mm
Maybe it's made me a bit more
Desensitize
or
you.
lowered, yeah, desensitized my sort
hmm
of risk aversion.
Okay. So if you had to um, basically give us the top three things that come up for you in regards to what our modern world can learn from hunter gatherers, what do you
Hmm.
think they would be?
Um, the number one by far is the need for social support and connection. I
hmm
think we in our society just have a norm. Firstly, being socially isolated isn't viewed. This is one area where it's the opposite. I see that as such a high risk problem, which we don't place enough weight on because it's so
mm
common for people to be isolated in terms of actually having connections. Of course, most people physically see others or probably even speak to others most days, but actually having
hmm
social relationships uh, value isolation is quite common, and it's it's just, I mean, I when I first heard the relationship that that social support is probably, alongside maybe smoking, but probably above smoking, the most important predictor of longevity and um, morbidity risk in high income countries where parasites and communicable diseases aren't causes of death. I mean, I was very skeptical of that, but now, I mean, if you look at the meta analyses and stuff, you can say very confidently that is the, if not right up there, most important driver. But that, looking at other societies, and in particular hunter gatherer societies, it's very unusual how sort of non community oriented our societies are. And I always think about how, say, someone got a promotion in our culture, right, and it was somewhere else, the idea of moving away from family and friends to take the promotion certainly isn't unusual. I think it's probably more common people would take the promotion and leave their family and friends. I
Yeah.
think this is sort of shared madness we have in our society, that we just do not value the importance of social relationships, community, and social support. And therefore, unsurprisingly, it's become the largest risk to our physical and mental health. And
Mm.
I think, looking at how hunter gatherers live in this shared residence, they have this camp where, as I say, there are lots of families living together. I think that a lot could be gained from that. And I have a research student now looking at the effects of living in co-housing residences. So, you get these residences where they've got shared spaces for cooking and shared living rooms and lots of communal spaces to try and encourage and foster close connection amongst people living in this shared building, this shared dwelling. I think there's some promise in that, and maybe that's something we should invest in more.
Mm.
So that's, I guess, that's the number one lesson. If I other two, I think maybe thinking about the possible benefits of giving children a bit more independence, or giving them a bit more credit to explore the environment. I think I'd sort of agree with the term helicopter parenting, that's quite common in our society, and maybe we should just give a bit more permission for children to explore the environment, keep an eye and intervene if possible, but don't jump straight away and be like, no, you can't touch that. And also
Mm.
credit even with slightly older children to help out with raising their younger siblings or getting exposure, because I think that there's a sort of killing two birds with one stone in this regard, that we
Mhm.
don't. So the NSPCC, which is like the Association for Child Protection, basically in the UK, their recommendation is that any pre-adolescent child should have a babysitter if they're going to be left alone, and that babysitter should be at least in their late teens, like basically 17, 18 or older. Whereas in hunter gatherers, we see from a very, very young age, kids are involved in childcare. And the
Mm.
developmental psychologist looked at some videos we had and suggested that even 4-year-olds were capable of sensitive care, where they knew how to
Mm.
interpret and respond to
Interesting.
signals of distress in
Right.
infants. So
Mhm.
I think encouraging children
Mhm.
to help look after their younger siblings, or having more mixed age interaction in schools, could really end up being a huge support for
Mm.
parents, where
Right.
really, again, a lack of support is such a major risk factor for perinatal mental health
Mhm.
problems. And it also will minimize, or certainly attenuate, this epidemic of perinatal mental health problems amongst first time parents who
Yeah.
feel completely inadequately equipped and
Mhm.
feel ignorant about how to look after a child. And you have cases. One of my colleagues has spoken to some cases where patients say that, well, I'd never even held a child before becoming a mother. Um, So you sort of got this dual effect of helping kids, helping parents, and also being much more
Yeah.
prepared for parenthood. I think there's a lot to be gained from that, and then more broadly letting kids explore is the sort of
So,
other there.
quick question in regards to this. I'm very curious, just educationally speaking, when children, let's say, reach their teens, or even when they're even a little bit younger, perhaps, I guess, what does education look like? Is it all, I mean, skill based, or are there also like stories that are told sometimes with a moral ending that teaches them to build some form of character? Like, what is that? What's that like?
Yeah, both of those things. So, in terms of more general skills and day to day learnings needed for effective functioning in the forest and in society, what we see is a very different picture to what we have here.
Mhm.
It happens through practice and play. So, it actually, I said this might. I'll try and give a brief summary here. The existence of childhood and the extended developmental period is a unique thing, a unique aspect of our species' life history. I mentioned that a chimpanzee is basically becomes self-sufficient around 5 or 10. Basically, after infancy, once they stop breastfeeding, other apes, other primates are self-sufficient very soon after that. Whereas we don't reach adulthood and sexual maturity until really late on, and the reason for that is we have this extended period of developing our embodied capital, which is the physical attributes, but also the capital in our brain, the skills and knowledge required for effective functioning in a hunter-gatherer context. So this really extended the developmental period prior to adulthood and independence. And the skills we were learning, it was all about exploration of the environment. Learning foraging skills. I mentioned,
Mhm.
men peak in their hunting ability around 30 or 35,
30,
but
yeah.
kids learning those foraging skills is all about interacting with the environment and trying things out, and it often happens in the context of play, in a sort of safer zone. So little kids, rather than going out hunting animals, they might be sort of making makeshift spears and sort of hunting insects, or make a sort of prompt which is like an animal, and they're climbing trees using techniques that adults would use but on much smaller
Mm.
trees. So to learn to fulfill the very function that childhood evolved for, it
Mhm.
was about exploration, interaction with the environment, high levels of activity, obviously, if you're learning foraging skills,
Mhm.
and happening in the context of play, which is the complete opposite to our education system, right? So, our education system isn't self directed, it's very much a teacher to child, it's passive, it happens via verbal instruction,
Mhm.
it happens in the context of people of the same age. So in every single feature of it, and work and play are two opposite things rather
Yeah.
than learning and play being two sides of the same coin. So it's they're more or less diametrically opposed. The time you
Mm.
see more direct verbal instruction in hunter gatherers, it's very rare. Well, it's much lower than other forms of learning, which are primarily imitation, emulation, practice, and play. The time you see verbal instruction is more like social norms, things which are visually opaque, right? You can see how to crack a nut, you watch it, that's how you learn. But knowing
Mm.
that, oh, you can't visit this river on days where there hasn't been a successful hunt or something like that. That, of course, needs to be told. You can't observe that directly. So
Mhm.
rules and norms are where
Okay.
you get verbal instruction.
Are there myths that they share, or
Yeah.
stories similar to that? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that was the other part of your question. Yeah, I mean, actually, one of my colleagues, this was with the Agta rather than the Bayaka, but he looked at storytelling, and I mean, it is crazy how much we love stories, right? I think we all
Yeah.
know
Hmm.
personally, right? We spend so much time watching TV shows and reading books, so we definitely have something sort of inherently. There are a few things where I'm just like, oh, this is embedded in humanity, right? babies
Yeah.
just ready to dance and clap, right? They just do it. They also just copy everything they see. That's just something ingrained in human, and also loving stories also just seems deeply embedded in human nature. Um,
Mm.
and I think looking at hunter gatherers, we see that in the Kung they talk about fireside stories a lot, and in the Agta, my colleague was looking at stories, and we published something on that. And yes, even now we talk about the moral of the story, and this very much is something to do with the function stories served throughout our
Mm.
species history. And he found there very much were stories were a way of basically broadcasting and reinforcing social norms, and the content was very much about cooperation or egalitarianism between the sexes, which a lot of people say is normative in many simple hunter gatherers. Um, so the stories very much transmit information about social norms and
Hmm.
modes of contact and uh, no, norms of conduct, and also the consequences for not following these norms.
Hmm.
And he
Hmm.
found, I mean, the basic result was that communities where there was more storytelling, he found were actually more cooperative in some economic games he
Oh.
played, and he found storytellers um, had higher fitness, so they were more preferred as cooperative partners. They received more gifts in these games. People wanted to live with them more often, and we saw that they actually had more children. Maybe they were more preferred as mates, or maybe because they're getting more food, they can have more surviving offspring, or whatever. Which initially I was a
Hmm.
bit skeptical about, but then I thought, well, that goes on in our society all the time, right? Like
Yeah.
actors, artists are so desired. Everyone wants to be their friend or be in a
Mm.
relationship with them. I mean, and I think that's probably been the same throughout our species history.
Hmm. Hmm. Excellent. Well, Nikhil, thank you so much for your presence and for sharing all of this. Uh, I only have one more question and then a series of rapid fire questions that I ask all my guests.
Okay,
So, my last question is simply what new projects are on the horizon for you and what's your ultimate goal?
sure. Um, so I've got more and more involved in uh, thinking about evolution and how evolutionary perspectives can help us understand mental health, the roots of mental health, possible preventative solutions. So I'd say broadly that is my research direction. I don't want to lose my interest and research into understanding human social behavior more generally, but there's a lot of my time is being dedicated to these questions, and I've got a lab now with some PhD students and postdocs, which includes two psychiatrists as well who have come in temporarily and paused their practice to do research. So yeah, getting at this question of, I guess maybe you could split it into two parts. One being, how can we make sense of the persistence of mental illness in our species? Why hasn't it been eliminated by natural selection? And there are a whole host of evolutionary processes that can help us make sense of that. And then the other
Mhm.
component, which a couple of people in my lab are looking into, and I've got one project related to, but my postdoc is very involved in doing studies looking at how understandings of these evolutionary explanations, what are the consequences of that, right? What does it mean if a patient understands the evolutionary explanation behind the illness they have, or if a clinician understands it, or if members of the public understand it? How does that affect levels of stigma, willingness to seek treatment? Um, we've just submitted something, the preprints out now, which my postdoc Adam study he led with a psychiatrist colleague, where he gave psychiatrists either recent genetic evidence related to anxiety or evolutionary explanations for anxiety, and he was measuring how these two different explanations had differential effects on how
Mhm.
psychiatrists, the prognosis they make, the type of treatment they would give, and stuff like that. So, yeah, what are the effects of evolutionary
Mhm.
explanations for mental health on the public,
Mhm.
on patients, and on clinicians? That's though I'd say those are two predominant arms in what I'm focusing on at the moment.
It's a wonderful mission. And anecdotally, I can share, during my feedback sessions when I come up with a particular diagnosis for a patient, oftentimes I will include as part of it an evolutionary perspective
Hmm.
as well. Because lots of times when we're looking at the ways feedback sessions have gone in neuropsychology, um, what is outdated is this sort of deficit model where you're just focusing on the deficits and not viewing them as
Yeah,
advantageous in any particular way. And it really complements the model, and definitely seems to help people make better sense of what's going on and reduce the
yeah,
stigma. I've definitely seen
yeah,
that experientially and directly through that. So
yeah,
I find that very, very important, and the work you're doing extremely fascinating and important. And it's so cool that you got to, and continue to do field work with the Bayaka or the Benjele. So
yeah. It's a
now let's
privilege.
yeah. hmm How does someone, by the way, get to do something like that? Like if I wanted to somehow participate in some way or spend some time doing research, is it possible for someone like myself to join in, or is it special
For
invitation only?
research or visit.
Research, field work, that sort of thing.
I guess it'd probably be about reaching out. I mean, there are all these processes with research of getting permits, and generally, I just think with working with these populations, the best way is to have to go yourself without any sort of indirect connection, but ideally you'd be with someone who does work with them. That's really the step.
Mm,
So it'd be about reaching out to people who work with hunter gatherers and saying, look, I really want to help out. Do you need a research assistant? Can I help with any project and come along with
mhm.
you? And yeah, I mean, obviously there are often lots of people who want to do that, so
Yeah, yeah,
it can be tough. But it's
competitive
about
pool.
what someone has to offer. Like I've got these two psychiatrists in my team because they can really bring something that I just can't. I can't. So it's great to have taken them out there and get their perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'd like now for us to move on to these rapid fire questions. First question for you is what's the last book that you read?
I'm listening to the audiobook right now of Hidden Valley Road, which is a book written about this family where there were 12 kids and six of them developed schizophrenia.
Oh,
Six out of the 12, and there were all sorts of other things that went on. I won't give it away in case anyone wants to read it, but it's interesting because you learn about how what the experience of the family, but side by side, they tell you a bit about the history. You're sort of indirectly learning about the history of how scientists were thinking about schizophrenia and how treatment changed and different perspectives changed. So it's sort of interesting scientifically, but also as a story of a family
mm,
in extreme circumstances.
okay. Is there a top philosopher or researcher that's influenced you?
Hmm.
Or who?
Yeah, I think in behavior generally, I'd go for Robert Trivers, who in so many domains was came up with seminal ideas about how evolution can explain cooperation, relationships between parents and offspring, and conflict in the family, things to do with self deception. Importantly, a lot of the work to do with differences in male and female mating preferences and strategies are rooted in his work and ideas of parental investment. So there are so many domains where I think he really laid the foundation for so much of our understanding now. Yeah,
Hmm,
Robert
okay.
Trivers. I believe
Are
there's a
you?
documentary about him now called Wildlife. There's not really good access to it in the UK, but may be available in the US. I think it probably is. Yeah, I think it's called Wildlife. But anyway, a documentary about Robert Trivers. Very eccentric, interesting guy.
Hmm.
So I saw the trailer for it. It looks amazing. So I highly recommend it just based on that alone.
Yeah, thanks for the recommendation. I'll have to check it out. By the way, are you aligned with the work of David Sloan Wilson and multi-level
Oh yeah,
selection?
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think multi-level selections are important. I mean, there are all these sort of debates and important mathematical work that's been done thinking about this. I think conceptually it's an important idea, and sometimes the preference or debates in these can sometimes either be semantic or more about the likelihood of something occurring versus it's whether it's theoretically sound.
Hmm.
So I think multi-level selections are an important idea, and certainly we think all the time about cooperation and altruism as recognizing the distinction between gene level selection and individual level selection. And sometimes something's good for genes and not for the individual. So, very
Mhm.
important process and
Okay,
framework.
excellent. And what type of music do you listen to?
Uh, a complete mix, like I'm sure is the case for a lot of people. I like a lot of like sort of singer songwriter, acoustic guitar and singing, but I also like hip hop. Um, yeah, I couldn't pin it down to one genre. Maybe I'll give you a band. I like Led Zeppelin. Um, I also really like Paolo Nutini. So
Hmm.
yeah, complete mix. I think.
Okay. Do you play an instrument?
I play the ukulele and then moved to the guitar, but I'm not musically talented at all. It's
Okay.
just for
Hmm.
myself.
Were there sing-alongs with the Bayaka, or like
Oh
times
yeah,
where people came together and?
yeah. The music, that's something else. In our society, you have certain individuals who are musicians, and that's like a great characteristic or talent, and not the norm. I mean, every single Bayaka individual is sort of a musician. You could say they're born,
Hmm.
they're from the moment they're born when they're crying. I mean, we still do this, but they're like sung to, and the rhythm is literally beat into their back. They're soothed by drumming on the back and singing, you could say. But they,
Hmm.
right from birth, they're these rituals they have fairly regularly where everyone in the community will be there. This is going from people who are so old they can barely move to a newborn infant. Everyone is there, more or less. And for hours and hours, they're singing and dancing and calling the spirits of the forest. And
Hmm. Hmm.
their music is amazing. They're amazing clappers. They're so good.
Hmm.
That's one thing. You think clapping is simple, right? They think it's hilarious when I'm clapping because they're doing such complicated and rhythmic clapping. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, the rituals are amazing
Hmm.
in so many ways. Yeah,
Uh, did you ever have any spiritual experiences in your life, or even with them?
yeah. They have lots of spirits of the forest. Is what
Hmm.
the best way I could translate it. And
Hmm.
with each of that, you can be initiated into each of those. You could say there's like a club, you're initiated into Spirit of the Forest A, and then you could also be initiated in Spirit of the Forest B, and so on. And each spirit either belongs to men or women. So I can only speak to men spirits of the forest, but I'm initiated into quite a few of those, and certainly
Wow.
the big ones, and those initiations have various structures to them, which we can
Hmm.
see present day as well. I mean, whether it be going to a fraternity at a US college, or you know, when you're or entering some religious group, we always see initiations. They often have particular structures,
Hmm.
like either some form of some challenge you have to go through, or some sort of humbling or
Yeah.
humiliation, or some sort of physical. bodily modification. So these are things that are very much present in the initiations I've been through, and those
Hmm.
same ingredients we see all around us today. Still,
Hmm. Did you get a body modification, like a tattoo or something, or is
I
it more like
have
a
I have
piercing of
got a
sorts?
modification here on my arm
Interesting.
where the way the way it would be all of this is embedded in so much secrecy, which is why I probably haven't spoken about it that much in this conversation. But whenever I do speak about the initiations or the spirits of the forest, there's one of the core functions is sharing secrets builds
Mm.
solidarity as well.
Yeah.
And so there's so much secrecy in how these things are spoken about. So all I be able to say about the body modification that's visible on me is that I was bitten by one of the spirits of the forest, which of course
Oh.
sounds crazy. But yeah, I mean, that's as far as I can go, really.
Okay. Well, thank you for even sharing that. All right. Do you believe in aliens?
Uh, if by that you mean that there's life somewhere else in the universe, I think, yeah, probably. But I think there's just probably too much focus and too many connotations with that word of us sort of attributing humanistic characteristics or intelligence. And, I think some of the life might be incredibly boring. Some might be interesting in ways that we can't even conceptualize because it's so different
Mm.
to our concept of what life looks like on our planet. But I'm totally open to the idea that there's nothing either as well. I'm open to the idea there might be something far more exciting than life, which again is just beyond what we can conceptualize. It's like, oh,
Mm.
can you imagine a color you don't know? I mean, there could be something. We think we put a lot of emphasis on life as this amazing thing. It is cool, but then I also think it's cool to us because we are living, but actually there are processes that go on in the universe which are just as cool, but just don't hold the same weight to us because we are life, so we're very interested in it.
Mm. What's something about yourself that most people don't know?
Mm, I don't know if I mean, if most people don't know it, it's probably because I've withheld it, in which case I wouldn't broadcast it now. But is this that I don't read many books? I was very lucky that you asked me the question of what book I was reading right now because I happen to be listening to an audiobook. Don't get me wrong, I read a lot because I have to read papers for work.
Mm.
But books themselves, I don't read that often, and I never have read that often. And I think people, when they hear that, are a bit surprised because they sort of assume that's part and parcel of academia or the type of people who go into academia. But yeah, I don't read many books.
Mm. Okay. And the final big question: do you believe in God?
No, I mean, again, it's about connotations, but I think the point of words is for communication, and the connotations usually when people are using that word without extra elaboration is referring to a god that is sort of got features of consciousness and knowledge
Mm.
and awareness and probably interest in our lives and maybe the ability to intervene, but at a minimum is got what we might call personhood, and that's how most people are conceptualizing of God.
Mm.
um, and to me that's fundamentally at odds with evolution because it's so human centric. I mean, the idea of thought and well, our place in the universe is just a sort of chance of random chance.
Mm.
So attributing significance to it, which I think the idea of God sort of it's inconsistent to some degree with human insignificance, and I do
Mm.
see humans as in a truth, as a matter of truth, insignificant, just a chance product of the universe
Mm.
unfolding. And that to me seems inconsistent with the common
Mm.
conceptualization of God.
So I know I said that was the last question, but in the debates that are currently going on in relationship to consciousness being more
Hmm.
fundamental than matter, or matter being more fundamental
Yeah.
than consciousness, or there being both, would you say you're more leaning towards the physicalist side, or?
Yeah, so I mean that I am really interested in this, although given how interested I am in it, I'm not expert in it at all. Um,
Mm.
but to me, I mean, there's this what's more fundamental, as you framed it, and then there's also the possibility that matter is fundamental, but consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, right? So
Right.
um, now, look, I just feel like, much smarter than by far the dominant opinion amongst scientists is that consciousness is emergent property of brain activity and
Mm.
isn't fundamental. And I just would be like, oh, well, people who know a lot more than me and who are much cleverer think that. But I have to say, intuitively, it seems far more parsimonious and plausible to me that matter, a fundamental property of matter, is that there's some unbelievably simplistic form of consciousness in it, which
Mm.
gets more and more sophisticated or complex as matter is arranged in more and more complex ways, and the brain being the pinnacle of that. That to me seems much more plausible that you've got the building blocks that, like gets more and more complicated than the
Mm.
idea that you've got a system, of neurons, and somehow you ultimately something is conscious or isn't. I mean, the sophistication and complexity of the consciousness, of course, varies a lot, but it is or isn't. And the idea that there's some point at which you could rearrange like a few neurons and you switch from something not being sentient and not having experience to having experience, even if that's
Mm.
just experience of temperature or something so simple. That to me seems much more like magic than the idea of saying some unbelievably simple form of consciousness or sentience is part of matter, inherently part of matter.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's indeed a very fascinating field right now. And um, while the majority do believe in emergentism, there is a lot more pushback these days
Yeah.
from many different scientists doing quite fascinating work. You might be interested in this term micropsychism,
Okay.
which kind of describes the point of view that you're sharing, but also,
Right.
the work of I would suggest Donald Hoffman, who I've had on my
Yeah.
podcast as well. And um, uh, there's a bunch of other people that we could chat about. But in any case, Nikhil, thank you so much for answering those rapid fire questions, and everything that you've had to share today is just wonderfully insightful and really fascinating. It's really, really great to have you on the podcast. And I'm glad that we were able to find the appropriate time for both of us. So,
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation, and really quick fire questions were really fun.
excellent. All right. Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.